My Lords, the Noble Lord Naseby has a long record of engagement in Sri Lanka, and the governments over the years will have been very grateful to him for that support. I thank him for his detailed briefing documents, which other speakers have clearly derived information from as well, even though these don't quite square with all the material I've also received from the House of Lords Library and elsewhere. It was very welcome when the long-standing conflict in Sri Lanka came to an end. Its conclusion was very brutal, as the government sought the total defeat of the Tamils. The UN claims that during this final offensive, as many as 40,000 civilians were killed. The human rights abuses allegedly committed against the Tamils included enforced disappearances, torture and arbitrary arrest, though both sides have been accused of war crimes. When President Sirisena, though a former ally of Rajapaksa's, was elected in 2015, it was a surprise win over the former president, who had a reputation of having encouraged severe repression of the minority Tamils. It was seen as a step in the right direction. The new president was backed by the Tamil National Alliance as well as the Tamil-speaking Muslims, largely due to his express commitment to reconciliation and government accountability. In coalition government, Mr. Wickramasinhe, and I apologise if I haven't got it correctly pronounced, Wickramasinhe, became his Prime Minister. Halting but insufficient steps were then taken towards addressing issues of accountability, missing persons, governance and land usage. The last year has seen a move away from this settlement. The President dismissed the Prime Minister in October 2018 and astonishingly installed Rajapaksa as the Prime Minister instead. The original Prime Minister refused to step down. MPs voted to reinstate him twice, upon which the President tried to dissolve Parliament. He also attempted to call a snap election. Rajapaksa began operating with his own newly formed cabinet, but an appeals court restrained this. In December, the Supreme Court ruled that the President had acted unconstitutionally and the original Prime Minister was reinstated. One of the encouraging features of this crisis has been the way in which the courts have played a key role in upholding the Sri Lankan constitution. So, in this unstable situation, should the international community back away from the Human Rights Council resolutions in the light of the US withdrawal, which 3 noble lords have just indicated should happen? Resolution 30/1 in 2015 outlined many steps that the government should take towards truth, justice, reparation and the prevention of human rights violations. Resolution 34/1 2017 called for any outstanding elements of the original resolution to be fully implemented. Sri Lanka co-sponsored both resolutions alongside the UK, the US, Macedonia and Montenegro. The resolutions will expire in March 2019, which is why this debate is indeed timely. The implementation of these resolutions has been very slow. The first resolution committed to establishing 4 transitional justice mechanisms, including an Office of Missing Persons, an Office for Reparations, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and a judicial mechanism to investigate violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. So far, only one of these goals has been partially met, with the Office of Missing Persons formed in September 2018. However, the interim office's reports recommendations have not been implemented by the government, although Lord Naseby's briefing tells us that the Ministry of Finance is looking towards including necessary funds in this year's budget. Perhaps the Noble Lord the Minister can say if the UK government understands that this is the case, and does he have any explanation as to why this is taking so long? A bill to create an Office for Reparations was narrowly passed in October 2018, but no concrete steps towards implementation have yet been taken. Lord Naseby's briefing states that nominations to this will be approved by the President. Is the Noble Lord the Minister concerned about that? The Draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act remains in place, despite the recommendation to review and repeal it. New anti-terror legislation is under review, but this is still not up to international legal standards. Some steps have indeed been taken on returning lands. In October 2018, the President finally called on authorities to return land in the north and east by the end of the year. Lord Naisby's briefing reiterates this. However, Amnesty notes that the authorities are yet to comply fully with this request and emphasises that many communities remain displaced. Amnesty notes that there have been welcome investigations opened into attacks on journalists, human rights defenders, religious minorities, and civil society organisations. These investigations, however, have not resulted in any convictions. They describe as dismayingly limited progress on accountability for torture, rape, sexual abuse, and gender-based violence. Sri Lanka established a consultative task force on reconciliation in January 2016. Over 7,000 Sri Lankans were consulted for the task force's report, which urged the government to chart a roadmap for fulfilling the UNHRC resolutions. But according to Amnesty, the government has ignored the task force's findings, with the Minister of Justice saying that he had, quote, no confidence in its findings. Under Resolution 30/1, a judicial mechanism, including the participation of Commonwealth and other foreign judges, also referred to as hybrid courts, was proposed by the Sri Lankan government. To date, there has been no progress on this front. In fact, the government has backtracked on its own commitments. In 2018, the President called for the international community to give Sri Lanka the room to solve the problems they're facing on their own. Government officials have rejected the involvement of foreign nationals in the hybrid courts. This kind of hybrid court surely must be held to, as was the case in Cambodia. Many Tamils and most of the international community feel that reconciliation has stalled. For example, the President was meant to bring about a new constitution that would devolve more powers to the provinces, including land registration and police power, which would increase Tamil self-determination. Talks on constitutional reform have been gridlocked, and devolution is now seen as a broken promise. The Tamil advocacy group, Together Against Genocide, has said that the Foreign Minister's international statements are contradicted by what senior government officials are actually doing in practice, and the Verite research group has echoed this. In 2017, after a fact-finding mission, UN Special Rapporteur Pablo de Greiff said that the reconciliation process had become increasingly ethnicized, with transitional justice being, and I quote, represented as if it were essentially a threat to the majority community. The UK has supported implementation of the resolutions through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. The programme's mandate will expire in 2019. Can I ask the Noble Lord the Minister what plans there are to renew this? With the US's withdrawal from the Human Rights Council, there is a concern that there will be less pressure put on Sri Lanka to implement the resolutions. The US has said they will continue to engage with Sri Lanka on truth and reconciliation, despite their withdrawal, but no concrete steps have yet been announced. Can the Noble Lord the Minister report on any discussions with the US on this matter? Amnesty notes, and I quote, as the 10th anniversary of the end of Sri Lanka's internal conflict looms in May, progress on UN Human Rights Council Resolution 30/1 has proceeded at a glacial pace. The hopes of the victims of crimes under international law and human rights violations and abuses during the conflict have been reduced to a flicker. This does not argue for the international community backing away. Clearly, as we've seen last year, Sri Lanka is in an unstable political situation. Progress thus far, of course, is to be welcomed, particularly the role of the courts in last year's political manoeuvres. But progress must be put in the context of what has been promised and what needs to be achieved. It would be premature to remove any of the pressure on Sri Lanka to adhere to the Human Rights Council's conclusions, and I hope that the Noble Lord the Minister will share that view.
My Lords, I too welcome the opportunity Lord Naseby has given